Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. The NDP passed a non-binding motion calling for the special rapporteur on foreign interference to step aside from his job. Supported by all opposition parties, Jagmeet Singh says this is about restoring confidence in Canada's electoral system.
Well, we made it really clear that the will of the House is that Mr. Johnston should be stepping down because of the appearance of bias. And I made it very clear this is not a personal attack. This is about the important role of the special rapporteur in this case to restore confidence.
David Johnston says that while he respects the opinion of the House, he has a duty to complete his mandate. Singh says that response is tone deaf. Okay, let's bring everybody in. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, and Althia Raj. Good to see you all on our regular Thursday. Chantal, let's start with you. I find this sort of fascinating from the strategic perspective for the NDP to do this, because they, of course, are also supporting the government, the minority government. I wonder whether you think it's effective and whether Mr. Singh has done a good job explaining why he thinks this is important.
Okay, so two things that Jagmeet Singh did that I think are worth mentioning. The first is to agree to read the entire material that Mr. Johnston has put on offer, which does not mean that he needs to be convinced by it that a public inquiry is not in order. But at least he is accepting that facts still matter. The other, I thought, yes, that asking for David Johnston to step aside because the perception is that he is mostly doing Justin Trudeau's bidding. Whether that's fair or not, that is the perception. It probably also makes sense. I think what David Johnston is missing is if he was going to go and recommend that no public inquiry was in order, he could not in the same breath say, trust me, I'll chart a way forward. That there should have been more balance, and he failed on the balance of his recommendations. I also believe that you cannot just say you respect the so-called opinion of the House. The will of the House expressed by 4 opposition parties made up of elected officials is something that is deserving of more than a passing notice in a press release.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was, I was kind of surprised that Mr. Johnston even responded, Andrew, at all, but then also that would be the response, that he felt he had to respond and then just say, I hear you, but no thank you.
Well, there's been a number of surprises here. It was surprising that he accepted the appointment. It was surprising that he did not recommend a public inquiry when everyone was expecting him to do so. And I certainly thought when all of the opposition parties have voted for you to step down, that you would persist and that the Prime Minister would persist in keeping him. I just find it extraordinary. The whole purpose of setting up this special rapporteur, remember, was because the Prime Minister openly said, I don't think people trust me on this. This guy you can trust because he's independent, he's nonpartisan, et cetera. But he had, as we've seen, and I think there's pretty broad consensus on this, a number of conflicts that would cause a reasonable person to doubt whether he could necessarily be an independent and impartial source on this. And perception is the name of the game in this. When we're dealing with something as fundamental as confidence in the electoral system, confidence in the fairness of our elections. So to cling on to office grimly like this, I just think is really unseemly. And I think there's a real question here, not just about national security or any of that, but about accountability of government to Parliament. This is absolutely fundamental. Yes, the government has the technical authority to persist like this, but good God, when you're talking about confidence in the electoral process, it ought to be listening to Parliament.
This is not to defend Mr. Johnston, but when I did interview him last week, it was very clear to me that he sees this as an act of public service. That is how he considers this role, and that it was something he is doing for his country. I mean, we can quibble with, as I think we have before, about whether that is.
I'm not questioning his motives. I'm not questioning his motives. I'm questioning his judgment.
Right. Yes. Okay. Chantal and then Althia.
Just let's be clear. When a government loses the confidence of 4 opposition parties that make up a majority, we hold an election. And the government can't say, I'm working for the public good, so I'm going to ignore the will of the House.
That's right.
So if it's serious enough to cause an election and the fall of a government, surely it's serious enough to tell a special rapporteur that whatever public service he has in mind, he needs to step aside.
Althia.
Yeah, I too was very surprised with Mr. Johnston's words. I'm I think he would have been better served, frankly, not to respond than to respond and say that his mandate comes from the government and thank you, but no thank you, members of the House of Commons. You know, my understanding from my conversations with David Johnston as well is that he really does seem to care a lot about trust in democracy, trust in our institutions. And I do feel like without recognizing that he is at the middle of all this controversy, he is helping further do damage to these two institutions. I want to go back to the question about Jagmeet Singh, though, because what I find really interesting in this scenario is that no one is saying the truth, and I don't know why he just doesn't come out and say the truth, which is he doesn't want Pierre Poilievre to be prime minister. And if we had an election right now over this issue, there are high chances that Pierre Poilievre would become the prime minister, and it's not a risk that he's willing to take. Why doesn't he just come out and say that, as opposed to, and I think that's the bigger problem than putting forward a motion asking for a public inquiry and for Mr. David Johnston to remove himself. You know, he's standing in the foyer of the House of Commons saying that the Prime Minister is putting his own personal interests ahead of the country's interest. Well, if the NDP leader really frankly believes that that is true, why does he continue with the charade? So if he put the context around, I think it would serve the public better than this fake saying that, oh, well, the Liberals really don't want to do our 27-point agreement, and that's why I must continue to support the government because I want to get these things done. We're having a whole hullabaloo around the fake issue, and he should just spill the beans so people understand what he's really doing.
It might be honest to say that. I don't think it'd be particularly honorable. There is a question here of the rights and responsibilities of Parliament. At some point, when the government is openly defying Parliament on such a matter of principle and of governance of the country, when they're simply refusing to hold public inquiry into a matter which cries out for a public inquiry, at some point you have to back that up. It's all very well to demand it, but if the government then just thumbs your nose at you, the only ultimate sanction is the willingness to vote no confidence in them.
Chantal.
Okay, so if Mr. Singh is putting his body in the way of Pierre Poilievre becoming prime minister, he must have different numbers than those that we see in the polls, including one today that shows basically the same dynamics and voting intentions as in the last election, which translated in a minority Liberal government. So thank you for saving the country from Pierre Poilievre, but that sounds glib. I think that Mr. Singh himself is not under a lot of pressure from a majority of New Democrats for pushing this to an election. And that is also clear in the polls. And he may be right, but if he doesn't believe that this warrants an election, he's going to have to say so at some point. I don't, like Andrew, I don't see the news conference where you say, well, you know, I don't want Pierre Poilievre, or the real honest truth, I don't want to lose the arrangement that gives me influence with fourth place in the Commons on the government.
Yeah, I don't want to have an election, and I don't want to lose that position. But Althia, I take your point. At some point, the outrage has to translate into something else, I would think.
Or you tone down the outrage. Like, I don't disagree with anything Chantal and Andrew has said. I just think, you know, and I think I've made this point before on this show, he cares more about seeing dental care implemented as a real program than he cares about pressuring the government to have a public inquiry.
Yeah, well,
he should just say that.
I'm just not sure there's anything more fundamental than the integrity of the elections to start with. And, is there anything more fundamental in the pursuit of integrity of elections than Parliament's role and responsibility of holding government to account?
But we're
if they're
talking
not
about
willing to do
different
this, the
things.
government can basically just rag the puck. They can just basically thumb their nose at Parliament, and nothing will be learned and nothing will be discovered on this fundamental question of Chinese interference in our elections.
Althia, then Chantal. Althia, then Chantal, then I gotta go.
I think we need to take a step back and realize we're not actually, no one is disputing that the Liberals won the last election. No. So it's not about the integrity of the election. There is no real fear that the next election won't be fair. What's really at stake here, what has been identified by all these experts that we've seen, what's identified in David Johnston's report, is that we have a serious problem with regards to how national security is treated by senior government officials, by the political class. Like, that's an issue. But is it an issue that Jagmeet Singh feels so passionate about that he wants to go to the polls?
Okay, last word, Chantal.
Well, I get the sense that none of us is buying Mr. Singh's argument that we can't have an election until we're sure that the system is fixed, because it's either in dire need of fixing and the last election is in doubt, which it isn't, or we could have an election. But I think that line did not work particularly well. Its logic was kind of wonky.
Yeah. Okay, that was a good conversation. Welcome to another round of At Issue. Ottawa is looking to protect ministers and some top public servants because of a rise in threats of violence. The new units would offer close protection to up to 10 ministers or top bureaucrats at a time in response to growing threats against politicians and an increasingly polarized political climate.
The threat landscape for politicians, I think of all political stripes, has changed dramatically since when I was elected.
Okay, let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. Andrew, why don't you start us off on this? I will say that the proposal that the RCMP is to protect cabinet ministers and top public servants. It is not to protect opposition leaders or MPs. It is to protect people in government, for whatever that says. But give me your thoughts on what it tells us about what's happening in this country.
Well, I'll just make the point off the top. I don't think the problem is polarization. The problem is extremism. There's nothing wrong with having sharp divisions on subjects that matter. We were divided over free trade. We've been divided over great issues. We're divided regionally. Those are things to be managed in the ordinary course of things. It's extremism when you stop listening to your opponents, you stop trying to make reasoned arguments, you stop the normal course of politics, you start demonizing people, and ultimately you start threatening them because you've so dehumanized them that you don't need to worry about their humanity. And that is a concern. You see some of that on all sides, but I will say it is particularly a problem on the right. And conservative, small c and large c, conservative leaders need to be paying attention to this and not whipping it up. And I do not see evidence of that, to say the least, from Pierre Poilievre.
Althia.
Yeah, I think Andrew hits the nail on the head. So many of our political leaders have spent, especially the past year and change, demonizing their political opponents, dehumanizing them, blaming them for things that frankly makes no sense. The Prime Minister is not responsible for violent crimes, most of the violent crimes in Toronto subways. But by making policy issues, personal issues, I think that climate of fear and has allowed kind of an acceptance of violence against the other. And you see that not just in federal politics, we see it provincially, we see it municipally across the country. Just in the last Quebec election, there were several folds. The Quebec Sûreté du Québec, the Quebec Provincial Police, actually has a call line for elected candidates or elected officials and candidates during elections to call and report threats, and it's gone up several folds. So it's a huge problem. What I find particularly interesting in this news story is that it's public officials as well, as in like civil servants. And we saw that in the US with Anthony Fauci and the death threats that he received during the pandemic. And so I do worry that by, it's good for democracy that our senior public servants are accountable and we put a face to their actions. But when it's just not a risk that you think that you're going to be engaged in, I think, when you take a job in the civil service. And it's really unfortunate that that has happened, and I'm glad that the Mounties are doing something about it.
Yeah, Dr. Tam is the person that was pointed to because she experienced obviously a number of threats over the course of COVID as she became a public figure and maybe said things that people didn't agree with. Chantal.
Also, the Governor General. I don't think it's just an issue with people who are in government. I would surmise that Jagmeet Singh, for instance, who is highly visible and recognizable, would be under as much threat as some cabinet minister, depending on who you mean. I don't think you can protect most elected officials, even if you try hard, from the risks of extremism. But I will back totally what Andrew has said about extremism coming at this point mostly from the right and being not encouraged as much as enabled in the way that Pierre Poilievre talks about people who are not on this site, which I find disturbing enough that there are days when I'd rather turn off question period before I decide to quit what I do for a living.
To give you a particular example, I see crazy and disgraceful things said about Pierre Poilievre online. I saw Pierre Poilievre in Parliament make an absolutely disgraceful insinuation about the Prime Minister, and I saw most of his caucus rising up and congratulating him and applauding him, with some honorable exceptions. But it was, I've never seen anything quite as appalling from an opposition leader that I can recall.
Yeah, that happened yesterday inside the House, and it'll be interesting to see if he repeats it outside. But Althia, how do you get away from that if you seem to think that it's working? If that's what Pierre Poilievre thinks is...
Why do you think it's working?
Well, I don't know, because
on what basis are we assuming it's working? Because I'm looking at polls that should show me the Conservatives way ahead of the Liberals after 3 terms and the kind of winter and spring that they've had. I'm not seeing that. So why do we keep saying it's working?
I'm not saying it's working. I'm saying that they seem to think it's working, and I say that because they keep doing it. So that's my question: is why would you keep doing it if you don't have evidence that it's working? Althia, you weigh in there.
Because they think that it's mobilizing a group of people that they want to come out to vote for them, whether that's new voters, people who are consuming information online, people who have fallen to conspiracy theories, and you talk to MPs, and so many constituents believe things that are just factually inaccurate. And a lot of them have given up actually trying to correct constituents and fighting with constituents. People are starting to live in alternate universes. They're getting news from different sources. We're living on different solar system, it seems, at times, and they do think it is working. That's why they keep doing it.
Chantal, final word to you on this.
So when is it not rage farming when you put some scenes from the Toronto subway and you say, Justin Trudeau did this to you? Yeah. And the person who is putting it online is the person who says he wants to be your next prime minister, not some Joe Blow who took pictures and doesn't like Justin Trudeau. What do you call that except irresponsible, reckless rage farming?
Okay, I got to leave it there. We'll continue this part of the conversation, I'm sure. Thank you all very much.